In the Sinai Peninsula, at an elevation of 5,000 feet above sea level, a monastic institution has operated continuously for over 14 centuries using design principles established in 548 CE. The facility's location, selected specifically for maximum separation from external interference, creates operational dependencies that exist nowhere else in institutional Christianity. Every supply delivery requires multi-day desert crossings. Water sources depend on ancient wells with finite capacity. Communication with the outside world relies on infrastructure designed for different geographic realities. The monastery functions as designed, a self-contained spiritual ecosystem optimized for isolation. Monks follow schedules identical to those established by Byzantine planners. Agricultural systems produce food using methods unchanged since construction. The institution reports normal operations year after year, maintaining the exact operational profile its founders intended. Yet this same isolation that enabled spiritual preservation for 14 centuries now generates failure modes invisible to traditional monastic design. Supply chain disruptions that affect accessible monasteries for days affect isolated facilities for months. Climate variations that represent minor inconvenience elsewhere threaten core operational capacity. Communication delays that cause administrative friction in connected institutions create existential vulnerabilities in isolated ones. The design assumption that isolation provides protection becomes questionable when isolation itself generates the primary operational constraints. How can an institution's greatest design strength become its most fundamental operational vulnerability? The Byzantine architects who conceived St. Catherine's Monastery in the 6th century operated under environmental and political assumptions that shaped every aspect of the facility's design. Emperor Justinian's engineers built the complex around the Chapel of the Burning Bush, incorporating thick granite walls designed to withstand both desert storms and human attacks. The fortress-like structure represented the pinnacle of defensive monastery design, with walls rising 60 feet and containing everything necessary for autonomous operation. The water system exemplified this self-sufficiency philosophy. Engineers identified 12 natural springs within the monastery grounds and designed cisterns to capture seasonal rainfall. The system assumed consistent aquifer levels based on observed patterns during the construction period. Agricultural terraces carved into the mountainside followed similar logic, with soil composition and irrigation channels calculated for crops that had thrived in the region for centuries. Storage facilities accommodated grain reserves sufficient for 3-year isolation periods based on historical siege duration data. These design calculations embedded specific assumptions about environmental stability. Groundwater tables would remain constant within observed seasonal variations. Annual precipitation would continue following established patterns. Soil composition would maintain fertility under traditional cultivation methods. Temperature ranges would remain within historical parameters. The monastery's agricultural terraces, water storage capacity, and food preservation systems were dimensioned according to these baseline environmental conditions. The structural engineering reinforced this assumption of environmental predictability. Granite blocks quarried locally provided thermal mass calculated for historical temperature extremes. Roof systems channeled rainwater to cisterns sized for typical precipitation patterns. Underground storage chambers maintained stable temperatures for food preservation based on observed ground thermal characteristics. Every engineering decision reflected confidence in environmental constancy. Byzantine administrative systems embedded similar assumptions about political and economic stability. Supply routes connecting the monastery to Egyptian and Byzantine markets assumed continued imperial control over trade corridors. Communication systems relied on messenger networks established for governing distant territories. Emergency support protocols presumed military assistance availability during external threats. The monastery's defensive capabilities were calculated assuming external military backing during extended sieges. The institution's operational protocols reflected these foundational assumptions. Crop rotation schedules maximized productivity under historical climate conditions. Water allocation systems distributed resources based on traditional consumption patterns and replenishment rates. Food preservation techniques optimized storage duration for historical temperature and humidity ranges. Maintenance schedules for infrastructure assumed material longevity under traditional environmental stresses. Religious practices became integrated with these operational assumptions. Fasting periods aligned with agricultural cycles designed for historical growing seasons. Prayer schedules accommodated work patterns optimized for traditional daylight and temperature variations. Festival timing coordinated with harvest cycles calculated for historical weather patterns. The spiritual calendar reinforced operational rhythms based on environmental predictability. Training systems for incoming monks embedded these operational assumptions as fundamental knowledge. Water conservation techniques taught traditional consumption rates adequate for historical replenishment patterns. Agricultural instruction focused on cultivation methods proven effective under historical climate conditions. Maintenance training emphasized repair techniques for infrastructure designed for traditional environmental stresses. Emergency protocols assumed resource availability patterns consistent with historical experience. The monastery's economic model reflected similar assumptions about external stability. Trade relationships with regional communities assumed continued political arrangements permitting commerce. Currency systems relied on imperial monetary policy maintaining exchange rate stability. Tax obligations presumed continued imperial administrative structures collecting revenue. Economic planning operated under assumptions of political and commercial continuity extending indefinitely into the future. Documentation systems preserved these operational assumptions as institutional knowledge. Records of successful practices reinforced confidence in traditional methods. Historical accounts of crisis survival validated existing emergency protocols. Architectural specifications encoded environmental assumptions in permanent structural form. Administrative procedures formalized operational patterns based on historical success. The monastery's relationship with external authority reflected assumptions about institutional autonomy within imperial protection. Independence in daily operations assumed continued imperial tolerance for religious self-governance. Local authority over internal affairs presumed stable relationships with regional political structures. Economic autonomy relied on continued access to traditional trade networks. Spiritual authority assumed continued recognition by imperial and ecclesiastical hierarchies. These embedded assumptions created systematic blind spots in institutional planning. Environmental monitoring focused on patterns that had remained stable for centuries rather than detecting gradual changes in baseline conditions. Resource planning projected future availability based on historical patterns rather than accounting for potential systematic shifts. Infrastructure maintenance emphasized preserving traditional functionality rather than adapting to changing operational requirements. The design philosophy that prioritized isolation as protection inadvertently created vulnerability to environmental and political changes that exceeded historical parameters. Systems optimized for autonomy under traditional conditions lacked adaptive mechanisms for responding to novel challenges. Institutional knowledge focused on preserving established practices rather than developing capability to modify operations under changing circumstances. Emergency planning exemplified this systematic limitation. Crisis protocols assumed external threats would follow historical patterns, military attacks, temporary supply disruptions, or seasonal resource shortages. Response capabilities addressed challenges that had been successfully managed in the past rather than preparing for novel threat categories. Resource reserves were calculated for crisis durations observed historically rather than accounting for potentially extended disruption periods. The integration of spiritual and operational systems reinforced resistance to systematic adaptation. Religious obligations that had evolved in harmony with traditional operational patterns created institutional momentum favoring preservation of established practices. Spiritual significance attributed to traditional methods elevated operational procedures beyond purely pragmatic consideration. Sacred aspects of daily routines made systematic operational changes appear to threaten fundamental institutional identity. These foundational design assumptions established the monastery as a masterpiece of medieval engineering optimization for specific environmental and political conditions. The facility achieved remarkable operational stability for centuries by perfectly aligning institutional capabilities with the environmental and political context of its creation period. However, This optimization created systematic vulnerability when the environmental and political context began changing beyond the parameters embedded in the original design assumptions. The operational framework that emerged from Byzantine design assumptions created training protocols and organizational structures optimized for managing predictable challenges within stable environmental parameters. These human systems, developed over centuries of successful operation, embedded cognitive patterns and decision-making processes that became counterproductive when baseline conditions shifted beyond historical ranges. Traditional monastic training emphasized mastery of established practices rather than adaptive problem-solving capabilities. New monks learned water management through observing seasonal patterns that had remained consistent for generations. Agricultural instruction focused on crop varieties and cultivation techniques proven effective under historical climate conditions. Infrastructure maintenance training emphasized preserving traditional functionality rather than diagnosing novel failure modes. The monastery's knowledge transfer system preserved operational wisdom through oral tradition and practical demonstration. Senior monks taught junior members to recognize normal variations in well water levels, seasonal temperature patterns, and agricultural productivity cycles. This experiential knowledge base excelled at managing routine fluctuations within historical parameters, but lacked frameworks for interpreting systematic changes that exceeded traditional variation ranges. Decision-making authority structures reflected assumptions about the nature of monastic challenges. The abbot's role evolved around providing spiritual guidance and arbitrating disputes over resource allocation during normal operations. Administrative hierarchies developed for managing routine institutional functions, rather than responding to technical emergencies requiring rapid adaptation to novel conditions. Authority patterns optimized for spiritual leadership became bottlenecks when operational decisions required technical expertise outside traditional monastic knowledge domains. Information flow patterns within the monastery reflected centuries of optimization for routine communication needs. Daily administrative meetings addressed standard operational issues, prayer schedules, work assignments, visitor management, and routine maintenance. Communication protocols efficiently managed information relevant to traditional monastic concerns, but lacked mechanisms for rapidly disseminating technical intelligence about environmental or infrastructure changes requiring immediate institutional response. The monastery's relationship with external expertise reflected assumptions about self-sufficiency that had historically served the institution well. Traditional practices emphasized internal problem-solving capabilities rather than developing relationships with external technical consultants. This autonomy had protected the monastery from external interference while providing operational independence during periods of political instability. However, the same autonomy created barriers to accessing specialized knowledge necessary for addressing technical challenges outside traditional monastic expertise. Resource allocation decision-making embedded assumptions about traditional consumption patterns and replenishment rates. Water usage protocols developed during centuries of stable aquifer performance allocated resources based on historical availability patterns. Food storage and distribution systems optimized allocation for seasonal variation ranges observed historically. These protocols functioned effectively when environmental conditions remained within traditional parameters but lacked adaptive mechanisms for managing systematic resource availability changes. Emergency response training focused on threats that had been successfully managed historically. Crisis protocols addressed military attacks, temporary supply disruptions, and seasonal resource shortages. Emergency resource allocation emphasized preserving essential functions during temporary disruptions rather than adapting operations for permanent environmental changes. Response capabilities excelled at managing acute threats with definite resolution timelines but struggled with chronic challenges requiring systematic operational modifications. Maintenance knowledge reflected centuries of experience with infrastructure performance under traditional environmental conditions. Monks learned to recognize signs of normal structural aging, routine equipment wear, and seasonal infrastructure stress patterns. Repair techniques emphasized restoring traditional functionality using historically successful methods. This expertise maintained infrastructure effectiveness under historical environmental conditions but became inadequate when novel environmental stresses exceeded design parameters. The cognitive framework embedded in monastic training created systematic biases in problem interpretation. Traditional explanatory models attributed operational variations to spiritual, seasonal, or administrative factors within established categories. Novel challenges were interpreted through these familiar frameworks, rather than recognized as indicators of systematic, environmental changes requiring new analytical approaches. This cognitive conservatism had preserved institutional stability for centuries, but created blind spots to environmental trends outside traditional experience. Communication with external authorities reflected assumptions about institutional autonomy and external support availability. Protocols for requesting emergency assistance assumed continued access to imperial or ecclesiastical support networks. Emergency communication procedures presumed functioning messenger systems and responsive external authorities. These systems had provided effective external coordination historically, but became unreliable when political structures changed or communication infrastructure became unavailable during extended crisis periods. Training in crisis leadership emphasized spiritual guidance and community cohesion during temporary hardships. Leadership development focused on maintaining morale and institutional unity during acute challenges with clear resolution pathways. Traditional crisis management assumed that persistent application of established practices would eventually restore normal operations. This leadership model excelled during temporary disruptions but lacked frameworks for guiding institutional adaptation during systematic environmental changes requiring permanent operational modifications. The integration of spiritual and practical training created resistance to systematic operational changes. Religious significance attributed to traditional practices elevated procedural elements beyond purely pragmatic consideration. Spiritual meaning embedded in daily routines made operational modifications appear to threaten fundamental institutional identity. Sacred aspects of traditional methods created institutional momentum favoring preservation of established practices even when environmental changes made adaptation necessary for survival. Knowledge preservation systems emphasized maintaining traditional practices rather than developing adaptive capabilities. Documentation focused on recording successful historical approaches rather than analyzing environmental trends or developing contingency protocols for novel challenges. Institutional memory celebrated consistency and tradition rather than innovation or adaptation. This emphasis on preservation had maintained institutional continuity for centuries, but limited capacity for responding to environmental changes requiring systematic operational modifications. Personnel development reflected assumptions about skill requirements based on traditional operational needs. Monk selection criteria emphasized spiritual calling and aptitude for established practices rather than technical problem-solving capabilities. Training programs developed expertise in traditional domains while creating knowledge gaps in areas outside historical monastic requirements. This specialization had supported operational excellence under traditional conditions, but left the institution vulnerable when novel challenges required expertise beyond traditional monastic knowledge domains. The organizational culture that emerged from centuries of successful traditional operation created systematic resistance to recognizing environmental changes requiring adaptive responses. Institutional pride in historical achievement reinforced confidence in traditional methods. Success narratives emphasized continuity and preservation rather than adaptation and innovation. Cultural values celebrating stability and tradition created psychological barriers to acknowledging environmental changes that might require systematic operational modifications. Quality control systems focused on maintaining consistency with traditional standards rather than adapting performance criteria to changing environmental conditions. Success metrics emphasize preservation of established practices rather than effectiveness under novel circumstances. Performance evaluation rewarded adherence to traditional protocols rather than innovative responses to emerging challenges. These quality control systems had maintained operational excellence under historical conditions, but became counterproductive when environmental changes made traditional approaches inadequate. The human factors architecture that had evolved to support traditional monastic operation created systematic constraints on institutional adaptive capacity. Training programs, decision-making structures, and organizational culture optimized for managing predictable variations within stable environmental parameters, became liability sources when baseline conditions shifted beyond historical ranges. The same human systems that had enabled centuries of successful operation under traditional conditions generated systematic barriers to recognizing and responding to environmental changes, requiring adaptive institutional responses. The divergence between traditional assessment methods and actual system conditions began manifesting through subtle indicators that fell within normal variation ranges according to historical experience. Traditional monitoring systems, calibrated for environmental patterns observed over centuries, continued reporting operational status as normal while underlying resource systems drifted toward critical thresholds that exceeded institutional detection capabilities. Groundwater monitoring relied on observational methods developed when aquifer levels remained stable within seasonal variation patterns. Monks assessed well performance by measuring water flow rates during morning collection routines and monitoring clarity changes that might indicate contamination or seasonal fluctuation. These traditional assessment techniques accurately tracked normal variations within historical parameters but lacked sensitivity for detecting gradual aquifer depletion occurring over multi-decade timeframes. The monastery's 12 natural springs had provided consistent water output for centuries, with seasonal variations following predictable patterns that aligned with regional precipitation cycles. Traditional knowledge recognized normal flow rate changes corresponding to wet and dry seasons, temperature variations affecting spring output, and temporary fluctuations caused by seismic activity. This experiential baseline enabled accurate assessment of spring performance under historical conditions, but created false confidence when gradual environmental changes began affecting aquifer recharge rates. Agricultural yield assessment followed similar patterns of traditional accuracy within historical parameters, combined with systematic blindness to gradual environmental changes. Monks evaluated crop performance using observational methods calibrated for historical climate conditions, soil composition patterns, and seasonal weather variations. Traditional agricultural knowledge accurately predicted yields under normal environmental conditions but attributed systematic productivity decreases to temporary factors like unusual weather patterns or soil quality variations rather than recognizing indicators of long-term environmental change. The monastery's agricultural terraces had produced consistent yields for centuries using cultivation methods optimized for historical soil conditions and climate patterns. Traditional farming techniques maximized productivity under established environmental parameters while maintaining soil fertility through crop rotation systems proven effective over generations. This agricultural expertise excelled at managing routine challenges but lacked frameworks for interpreting systematic yield decreases that might indicate fundamental changes in growing conditions. Temperature monitoring relied on sensory assessment methods that accurately tracked daily and seasonal variations within historical ranges. Monks recognized normal temperature patterns affecting food preservation, infrastructure performance, and agricultural productivity. Traditional knowledge provided accurate predictions for seasonal temperature changes and their operational implications under historical climate conditions. However, these assessment methods interpreted gradual temperature increases as temporary variations rather than systematic climate changes requiring operational adaptations. Infrastructure performance assessment followed traditional patterns that accurately identified normal aging and seasonal stress effects, while missing systematic changes in environmental loading conditions. Monks monitored structural performance through visual inspection methods calibrated for traditional environmental stress patterns. These techniques effectively identified routine maintenance needs and normal deterioration patterns, but failed to recognize systematic infrastructure stress increases caused by environmental conditions exceeding design parameters. The monastery's granite construction had performed reliably under historical environmental conditions, with thermal expansion and contraction cycles following predictable seasonal patterns. Traditional maintenance knowledge accurately predicted structural stress patterns and identified normal repair requirements. Infrastructure assessment expertise excelled at preserving traditional functionality but lacked frameworks for recognizing systematic increases in environmental loading that might require structural adaptations or accelerated maintenance schedules. supply chain assessment relied on traditional communication methods that accurately tracked routine delays and normal variation patterns in external resource availability. Monks monitored supply deliveries through established merchant relationships and messenger networks that had functioned reliably for centuries. Traditional supply management expertise accurately predicted normal variation ranges in resource availability and delivery schedules under historical political and economic conditions. External trade relationships had provided consistent resource access through established commercial networks, connecting the monastery to regional markets. Traditional knowledge recognized normal fluctuations in price, availability, and delivery reliability corresponding to seasonal patterns, political events, and economic cycles. This commercial expertise accurately managed routine variations but interpreted systematic increases in supply chain disruptions as temporary political or economic instabilities, rather than recognizing indicators of fundamental changes in external conditions. Communication system performance followed traditional reliability patterns that accurately handled routine administrative needs while becoming inadequate for managing complex technical information requiring rapid response. Traditional communication methods efficiently transmitted information relevant to normal monastic operations, but lacked capacity for conveying detailed technical intelligence about environmental changes or infrastructure problems requiring specialized external consultation. The monastery's messenger networks had provided reliable communication with external authorities and commercial partners under historical political conditions. Traditional communication protocols efficiently managed routine administrative correspondence and emergency assistance requests. Communication expertise excelled at maintaining external relationships under normal conditions, but became inadequate when novel challenges required rapid access to specialized technical knowledge outside traditional monastic domains. Visitor management systems assessed normal variation patterns in pilgrimage traffic and routine administrative visitors while missing systematic changes in external conditions affecting long-term institutional sustainability. Traditional visitor protocols efficiently accommodated normal pilgrimage cycles and administrative visits under historical conditions, but lacked frameworks for interpreting systematic changes in external support patterns that might indicate fundamental shifts in institutional environment. Economic performance assessment relied on traditional accounting methods that accurately tracked routine income and expenditure patterns while missing systematic changes in economic conditions affecting long-term institutional viability. Monks monitored economic performance through established bookkeeping systems calibrated for historical income sources and operational costs. Traditional financial management accurately tracked normal economic variations but interpreted systematic changes in external economic conditions as temporary fluctuations rather than fundamental shifts requiring adaptive responses. The cumulative effect of these assessment limitations created an institutional blind spot, where traditional monitoring systems continued reporting normal operational status, while underlying systems drifted toward critical thresholds. Each individual indicator remained within historical variation ranges according to traditional assessment criteria, preventing recognition that systematic environmental changes were affecting multiple operational domains simultaneously. This systematic assessment failure reflected the monastery's optimization for environmental stability, rather than environmental change detection. Traditional monitoring systems excelled at tracking variations within established parameters, but lacked sensitivity for detecting gradual changes that occurred over time frames exceeding institutional memory. The same assessment expertise that had ensured operational success under historical conditions created false operational confidence when environmental baseline conditions began changing beyond traditional experience ranges. The institutional knowledge that enabled accurate assessment under historical conditions became a systematic liability when environmental changes required recognition of novel patterns outside traditional experience. Traditional assessment methods continued providing accurate readings within their design parameters, while fundamental system conditions changed beyond their detection capabilities, creating dangerous gaps between perceived and actual operational status. The mathematical relationships governing resource consumption and environmental capacity follow predictable equations that operate independently of institutional intentions or traditional management practices. When consumption rates exceed regeneration capacity, system degradation becomes inevitable regardless of operational adjustments that remain within traditional parameters. The monastery's resource systems had crossed critical mathematical thresholds, while traditional management methods continued, operating under assumptions of environmental stability. Groundwater depletion follows hydrological equations that relate consumption rates to aquifer recharge capacity through measurable physical parameters. The monastery's 12 springs drew from aquifers recharged by precipitation patterns and underground flow systems established over geological timeframes. When regional precipitation decreased systematically while consumption remained constant, aquifer levels declined following predictable mathematical relationships between inflow and outflow rates. Traditional water management had maintained sustainable consumption under historical recharge conditions by balancing daily usage with observed seasonal replenishment patterns. The system achieved equilibrium when annual consumption approximated annual recharge, with aquifer levels fluctuating within normal seasonal ranges. However, when systematic decreases in regional precipitation reduced recharge rates below consumption levels, aquifer depletion became mathematically inevitable regardless of traditional conservation practices. The physics of aquifer depletion creates irreversible changes in groundwater system performance that cannot be corrected through operational adjustments alone. As water tables decline, spring output decreases following predictable relationships between hydraulic pressure and flow rates. Wells that had provided consistent output under historical water table levels experienced systematic flow reduction when aquifer levels drop below critical thresholds, creating operational shortfalls that traditional conservation methods cannot compensate. Soil degradation follows chemical and physical processes that relate cultivation intensity to soil composition through measurable parameters affecting agricultural productivity. The monastery's terraced agriculture had maintained soil fertility under historical conditions through crop rotation systems and organic matter management that balanced nutrient depletion with natural replenishment processes. This traditional agricultural system achieved sustainability when nutrient consumption approximated soil regeneration capacity. Temperature increases affect soil chemistry through evaporation rates that alter moisture content and nutrient availability according to established thermodynamic relationships. Higher temperatures increase water evaporation from soil, reducing moisture content available for plant nutrition while concentrating salts that can inhibit crop growth. These chemical processes follow predictable equations relating temperature, humidity, and soil composition to agricultural productivity outcomes. The mathematics of soil degradation creates systematic productivity decreases that traditional farming methods cannot prevent when environmental conditions exceed design parameters. Increased evaporation rates reduce soil moisture content below levels necessary for optimal plant nutrition, while concentrated salts create chemical conditions that inhibit root development and nutrient absorption. These physical processes operate according to chemical laws that make productivity decreases inevitable when temperature and humidity conditions exceed traditional ranges. Thermal stress on traditional building materials follows physics equations relating temperature variation to material expansion and structural loading. The monastery's granite construction had performed reliably under historical temperature ranges, with thermal expansion and contraction cycles remaining within material design limits. Stone masonry systems maintain structural integrity when thermal stress remains below critical thresholds determined by material properties and construction techniques. Systematic temperature increases create thermal loading conditions that exceed design parameters for traditional construction materials and techniques. Granite expands according to predictable thermal coefficients that relate temperature changes to dimensional changes and internal stress levels. When temperature ranges exceed historical parameters, thermal expansion creates structural stresses that can exceed design limits for traditional masonry techniques, leading to systematic infrastructure degradation. The physics of thermal expansion creates structural damage that traditional maintenance methods cannot prevent when environmental conditions exceed material design limits. Thermal stress accumulates according to mathematical relationships between temperature variation and material properties, creating internal forces that can exceed mortar strength and joint tolerance. These physical processes follow engineering equations that make structural damage inevitable when thermal loading exceeds traditional construction design parameters. Supply chain mathematics relate distance, transportation capacity, and delivery frequency to resource availability through logistical equations that determine operational reliability under specific transportation conditions. The monastery supply systems had functioned reliably under historical conditions by balancing resource consumption with delivery capacity and transportation reliability. This logistical equilibrium maintained adequate resource availability when transportation conditions remained within established parameters. Political instability affects supply chain reliability through disruption patterns that alter transportation schedules and route availability according to measurable factors affecting commercial operations. Regional conflicts create transportation delays and route closures that follow predictable patterns based on military activity, political control, and economic conditions. These disruption patterns operate according to logistical equations relating political stability to commercial transportation reliability. The mathematics of supply chain disruption create resource shortages that traditional inventory management cannot prevent when transportation conditions exceed historical reliability parameters. Extended delivery delays reduce resource inflow below consumption rates, creating systematic shortages that exhaust reserve capacity according to mathematical relationships between consumption, delivery frequency, and storage capacity. These logistical processes follow predictable equations that make resource shortages inevitable when supply chain reliability degrades beyond traditional parameters. Energy balance calculations relate operational requirements to available energy sources through thermodynamic equations that determine system sustainability under specific environmental conditions. The monastery's energy systems had achieved balance under historical conditions by matching heating, cooling, and operational needs with available fuel sources and passive environmental control systems. This energy equilibrium maintained operational comfort when environmental conditions remained within traditional ranges. Climate changes affect energy requirements through thermal equations that relate temperature conditions to heating and cooling demands. Higher temperatures increase cooling requirements while potentially reducing heating needs, altering overall energy consumption patterns according to thermodynamic relationships between environmental conditions and comfort maintenance. These energy demand changes follow predictable equations relating climate conditions to operational energy requirements. The mathematics of energy balance create operational constraints that traditional energy management cannot address when environmental conditions exceed historical parameters. Increased cooling demands can exceed available energy capacity, while traditional energy sources become insufficient for maintaining operational comfort under novel environmental conditions. These thermodynamic processes follow engineering equations that make energy shortages inevitable when climate conditions exceed traditional energy system design parameters. The cumulative effect of these mathematical relationships creates systematic operational degradation that traditional management methods cannot prevent or reverse once critical thresholds are exceeded. Resource depletion, infrastructure stress, supply chain disruption, and energy imbalances operate according to physical laws that make system failure inevitable when environmental conditions exceed design parameters regardless of institutional intentions or traditional management expertise. When traditional management methods proved insufficient for addressing systematic resource shortfalls and infrastructure stress, the monastery implemented emergency measures designed to maintain core operations while preserving institutional continuity. These stabilization attempts, optimized for preserving traditional practices under novel constraints, created secondary operational dependencies that traditional management systems could not effectively control or maintain. Emergency water conservation protocols reduced daily consumption through rationing systems that allocated available water supplies according to priority hierarchies based on traditional operational requirements. Essential functions received guaranteed allocation, while discretionary uses faced systematic restrictions designed to extend available water supplies during perceived temporary shortages. These conservation measures successfully reduced immediate consumption pressure while creating operational stress in secondary systems dependent on traditional water availability. The implementation of strict water rationing affected agricultural operations that had relied on consistent irrigation schedules developed for traditional water availability patterns. Reduced agricultural water allocation forced modifications in cultivation practices, crop selection, and growing schedules that deviated from traditional farming methods proven effective under historical conditions. These agricultural adaptations maintained minimal food production while reducing yields below levels necessary for traditional food security planning. Modified irrigation schedules disrupted soil moisture patterns that had supported traditional crop varieties selected for consistency with historical growing conditions. Reduced water availability forced cultivation of drought-resistant crops with lower nutritional content and shorter storage life compared to traditional food sources. These agricultural modifications maintained some food production while creating nutritional deficiencies and food storage challenges that traditional preservation methods could not adequately address. Emergency supply chain arrangements established alternative procurement methods that bypassed traditional merchant relationships in favor of expedited delivery systems requiring advance payment and guaranteed transportation security. These emergency procurement protocols increased resource availability reliability during supply chain disruptions while creating financial obligations that exceeded traditional economic planning parameters and committed future monastery revenues to external suppliers. Alternative transportation arrangements required helicopter deliveries and mechanized transport systems that provided reliable resource access independent of traditional ground-based supply routes affected by regional instability. These transportation solutions eliminated supply chain delays while introducing operational dependencies on mechanical systems, fuel supplies, and specialized maintenance services that traditional monastery operations could not provide or control independently. The implementation of emergency transportation systems created noise pollution and environmental disruption that conflicted with traditional monastic practices emphasizing silence, contemplation, and environmental harmony. Helicopter operations generated acoustic disturbances during prayer times, while mechanized transport systems required fuel storage and maintenance facilities that altered the monastery's traditional aesthetic and environmental characteristics. Infrastructure adaptation measures addressed thermal stress and structural degradation through engineering modifications that reinforced traditional construction using modern materials and techniques. Emergency structural reinforcement prevented immediate building failure while introducing construction materials and engineering approaches that required specialized maintenance knowledge outside traditional monastic expertise domains. Modern cooling systems provided environmental control for essential facilities while creating energy consumption requirements that exceeded traditional energy system capacity. Emergency electrical generation equipment maintained cooling system operation while requiring fuel supplies, technical maintenance, and operational expertise that traditional monastery systems could not provide independently. These environmental control adaptations preserved essential functions while creating technological dependencies that traditional operations could not sustain long-term. Communication system upgrades established satellite communication capabilities that provided reliable external connectivity independent of traditional messenger networks and ground-based communication infrastructure affected by regional instability. Modern communication technology enabled coordination with external technical consultants and emergency support services while requiring specialized maintenance, operational training, and ongoing service contracts that exceeded traditional administrative capabilities. Emergency coordination with external technical consultants provided specialized expertise for addressing infrastructure problems and environmental challenges outside traditional monastic knowledge domains. Technical consultation services offered solutions for systematic operational problems while creating dependencies on external expertise that traditional monastery systems could not replicate or maintain independently. These consulting relationships provided essential problem-solving capabilities while reducing institutional autonomy and self-sufficiency. The integration of modern technological solutions with traditional operations created interface challenges where contemporary systems required operational protocols that conflicted with traditional practices and institutional values. Technological dependencies introduced maintenance schedules, training requirements, and operational procedures that deviated from traditional monastic routines, while creating performance standards that traditional methods could not achieve. Emergency personnel additions brought external technical specialists into the monastery community to maintain modern systems and provide specialized expertise for environmental challenges. Technical staff provided essential capabilities while introducing personnel management challenges related to integrating non-monastic personnel into traditional community structures designed for homogeneous religious communities with shared values and practices. Financial emergency measures accessed external funding sources through heritage preservation grants, religious organization assistance, and governmental cultural protection programs that provided financial resources for maintaining operations during resource shortages. External funding maintained operational capacity while creating financial obligations, reporting requirements, and administrative oversight that conflicted with traditional institutional autonomy and self-governance principles. Regulatory compliance requirements associated with external funding and modern system implementation required administrative capabilities and legal expertise outside traditional monastic administrative systems. Compliance obligations created administrative burdens that consumed institutional resources while introducing external oversight and performance standards that conflicted with traditional religious authority structures and autonomous governance practices. The cumulative effect of emergency stabilization measures created an institutional configuration that maintained essential functions while fundamentally altering the monastery's operational character and dependency relationships. Emergency solutions preserved institutional survival while creating technological, financial, and administrative dependencies that traditional monastic systems could not control or sustain independently, generating new categories of operational vulnerability that traditional emergency planning had not anticipated. These stabilization efforts succeeded in maintaining immediate operational continuity while creating secondary crisis conditions where traditional institutional capabilities became inadequate for managing the technological and administrative complexity required to sustain emergency solutions. The monastery achieved operational preservation through adaptations that undermined fundamental aspects of traditional monastic self-sufficiency and autonomy that had originally enabled institutional survival under historical conditions. The forensic analysis conducted after the crisis stabilization period revealed systematic documentation discrepancies between institutional preservation requirements and operational sustainability needs. UNESCO World Heritage Designation protocols required maintaining traditional architectural elements, operational methods, and environmental characteristics that conflicted with engineering adaptations necessary for environmental change management and long-term institutional viability under altered baseline conditions. Heritage preservation mandates specified construction material authenticity requirements that prohibited modern structural reinforcements necessary for managing increased thermal stress and environmental loading beyond traditional design parameters. Preservation protocols emphasized maintaining original Byzantine construction techniques and materials, while engineering analysis demonstrated that traditional construction methods could not withstand systematic environmental changes affecting structural performance and safety margins. Archaeological documentation requirements mandated preservation of traditional agricultural terraces and irrigation systems as historic features, while hydrological analysis revealed that traditional water management infrastructure had become inadequate for managing systematic aquifer depletion and altered precipitation patterns. Preservation obligations conflicted with water system modifications necessary for maintaining agricultural operations under changed environmental conditions. Environmental protection standards required maintaining traditional landscape characteristics and minimizing modern infrastructure visibility, while operational necessity demanded communication systems, transportation access, and mechanical equipment that altered the monastery's traditional aesthetic and environmental profile. Heritage compliance obligations created barriers to implementing technological solutions necessary for institutional survival under novel operational constraints. documentation analysis revealed systematic gaps between traditional assessment methods and actual resource consumption patterns that had developed over decades as environmental conditions gradually changed beyond historical parameters. Traditional bookkeeping systems accurately recorded water usage according to established measurement categories, while failing to detect systematic increases in per-unit consumption requirements caused by higher evaporation rates and reduced aquifer output efficiency. Agricultural productivity records demonstrated systematic yield decreases that had been attributed to temporary weather variations rather than recognized as indicators of fundamental growing condition changes requiring adaptive cultivation strategies. Traditional record-keeping categories captured seasonal productivity variations accurately, while missing multi-year trends indicating systematic soil degradation and climate condition changes affecting agricultural sustainability. Infrastructure maintenance logs documented repair activities according to traditional maintenance schedules, while missing systematic increases in maintenance frequency and complexity that indicated environmental loading beyond traditional design parameters. Traditional documentation systems recorded individual repair events without analytical frameworks for recognizing patterns indicating systematic infrastructure stress requiring design modifications or replacement. Financial analysis revealed systematic increases in operational costs that had been accommodated through emergency measures and external funding, while traditional economic planning models remained based on historical cost structures that no longer reflected actual operational requirements. Economic documentation systems accurately tracked individual expenditures, while failing to recognize systematic cost structure changes indicating fundamental operational economics alterations. Energy consumption analysis demonstrated systematic increases in heating, cooling, and mechanical system requirements that exceeded traditional energy planning assumptions, while energy system documentation continued using historical consumption categories that did not reflect altered operational demands. Traditional energy accounting recorded usage accurately within established categories while missing systematic changes in energy requirements, indicating fundamental operational condition modifications. Supply chain reliability analysis revealed systematic increases in delivery delays, transportation costs, and procurement complexity that had been managed through emergency arrangements, while traditional logistics planning remained based on historical supply chain performance parameters. Supply documentation systems accurately recorded individual delivery events while failing to recognize patterns indicating systematic supply chain reliability degradation, requiring logistical strategy modifications. Communication system performance analysis demonstrated systematic increases in external coordination requirements for technical consultation, emergency support, and regulatory compliance that exceeded traditional administrative capabilities, while administrative documentation continued using historical communication categories. Traditional administrative records accurately tracked routine correspondence while missing systematic increases in external communication complexity, indicating fundamental administrative requirement changes. Personnel management analysis revealed systematic skill requirement changes for maintaining modern emergency systems and managing external coordination obligations that exceeded traditional monastic training and expertise development programs. Personnel documentation systems accurately recorded individual training activities while failing to recognize systematic changes in skill requirements, indicating fundamental operational complexity increases. The cumulative forensic evidence demonstrated that institutional preservation mandates and operational sustainability requirements operated according to incompatible design principles that created systematic institutional stress regardless of management expertise or resource availability. Preservation obligations emphasized maintaining traditional practices and characteristics, while operational sustainability required adaptive capacity and technological integration that preservation protocols specifically prohibited or restricted. Regulatory framework analysis revealed systematic conflicts between heritage protection requirements and environmental adaptation necessities that created legal and administrative barriers to implementing technical solutions necessary for institutional survival under changed environmental conditions. Preservation compliance obligations consumed institutional resources while preventing adaptive responses that environmental analysis indicated were necessary for long-term viability. Long-term viability calculations demonstrated that maintaining heritage preservation compliance under systematic environmental changes required external support levels that exceeded available funding sources and created dependency relationships that undermined institutional autonomy principles fundamental to traditional monastic operation. Preservation objectives and sustainability requirements operated according to mathematical relationships that made simultaneous achievement impossible under changed environmental conditions. The forensic analysis revealed that traditional institutional design philosophy assumed environmental stability as a fundamental parameter, while operational reality demonstrated that environmental change represented the primary long-term institutional challenge. Traditional design optimization for specific environmental conditions created systematic vulnerability when those conditions changed beyond adaptation capabilities embedded in preservation-focused institutional design. Heritage preservation requirements that had successfully maintained institutional continuity under historical environmental conditions became systematic barriers to adaptive responses necessary for institutional survival under novel environmental conditions. The same preservation focus that had enabled 14 centuries of continuous operation created institutional constraints that prevented adaptive modifications necessary for managing systematic environmental changes exceeding historical parameters.